So we'll spend the next 45 minutes-ish talking about, thinking about data visualization of your data and using our resources to do that. So here's the plan. So I'll give some examples of some of the visualizations we've done in the past and some examples of things we worked on. Talk a little bit about what resources we have for doing visualization in terms of hardware, and then talk some about visualization tools and data formats. Spend a bunch of time on different types of data representation, so things you can think about in terms of how you want to represent your data. A little bit of beyond using visualization sort of as your final product of wanting, for conveying your science or explaining it. Also using Viz for other things like debugging and such, because it can be a useful tool for understanding what's happening in your code and that sort of thing. And then I'm going to turn things over to Silvio, and he's going to talk a bit more about in situ visualization and analysis. And I'll touch on that a little bit in as I go along, but Silvio will dive into that in more detail. So a couple of examples of some visualizations. So this is from a project from a few years ago now that in a team we've worked with off and on for, I've worked with them probably close to 15 years now, off and on. And so they're interested in visualizing blood flow, in particular blood flow in the brain, and specifically looking at aneurysms, right? So this is this aneurysm, which is basically a balloon sort of weakness in the artery wall that's formed, and so they want to look at how the overall blood flow in these arteries, and in particular the aneurysm, and how that impacts blood platelet buildup on the wall of the aneurysm. That could potentially lead to the aneurysm to clot, or this clot to cause the aneurysm to burst, or a chunk of this to break free and cause an obstruction downstream. And so one of the interesting things about this project was that it's a multi-scale simulation and visualization problem, where the overall blood flow in the system, so these swirly lines you see, the path that the blood flows in the system is computed with a fluid dynamics code, so it's more coarse grained. And then the particle buildup is a particle dynamics simulation that's coupled. So they couple these two codes. And one of the I find interesting parts about it is that the fluid flow code ran on, this is actually ran on the previous machine, but it ran on one rack of the supercomputer. And the particle dynamics in this small subregion ran on 31 racks. Right? And so there's much more going on here, and there's no way to do this level of detail in the entire system. And so that's why it's important to be able to couple these different scaled codes together, which obviously poses some challenges for both the simulation and for the visualization. So this is an example of, obviously, climate. I guess I'm not going to talk too much about this one other than this is another example of the types of visualizations that we do, where they started with observed data as the input to their models, and then simulated forward, and then they can go back and compare their simulated results with the observed results. And so this is a visualization that helped them do that. In addition to, so this is a project from General Electric that's looking at jet noise, noise from this jet nozzle. And you'll see this image again later when I start talking about some of the specific representations. But so this is just an example of that, and to sort of talk a little bit about, touch on, in addition to having partners and collaborators that use our facility that come from academia and other national labs, we also have partners in industry that use the resources too. Just a couple quick examples of more material molecular science types of representations. So, and I'll cover this a little bit when I start talking about tools. That some of the tools that we use are more sort of general purpose, and so most of the images that you saw so far were come from these sort of more general purpose large scale viz tools, and then there's others that are more domain specific. And so these are some examples of that. This is an example of cosmology visualization, looking at dark matter evolution. And this is using a volume rendering code, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But this is a tool that our team developed for visualizing large scale, essentially regular grid data sets, looking at, in this case, cosmology. So a little bit about our resources. I believe we have reservations on Cooley and available for the workshop. So Cooley's our analytics and visualization cluster. There's 126 nodes. Each node has 2 Haswell 6-core processors, as well as an NVIDIA K40 graphics, which is essentially, it's addressable as 2 separate K40. So they're essentially 2 GPUs per node. And a significant amount of memory. So each node has 384 gigs. So one of the important aspects of this is that in addition to sharing network with Mira, I don't know that it's directly connected via InfiniBand with Theta, but it does mount the same file systems as Mira, Satis, and Theta. Those are different file systems, but Cooley, the Viz cluster, mounts both of those file systems so that you can get direct access to your project directories to do visualization in parallel using Cooley without needing to move data around. So this resource accesses both. So a little bit about now about some of the tools that are out there. And so many of these, this is obviously not a comprehensive list, but a list of a lot of the tools that are out there for doing these types of things. Not all of them are available on our resources. The ones in blue are available on Cooley, and the Visit and PairView are the 2 primary ones that we have available on Theta. So you can do visualization directly on Theta without using the needing to use the Cooley for that. So Visit and PairView, which I'll talk a little bit more about as we go, those are sort of the general purpose type Viz tools that I mentioned. Insight is another that's a commercial product, so we don't have licenses for that on our resources, but it is an application that gets used pretty widely in the community. Again, I mentioned there's some more domain-specific tools like VMD. Oviedo is another. In particular, those 2 are for doing molecular dynamics type visualizations. There's APIs like VTK is the visualization toolkit. A lot of these other tools are built on top of them, on top of that API, and as well as some other codes that, for example, our volume renderer that I mentioned, VL3, it leverages the GPU to get better performance. So it uses shader-based volume and particle rendering for that. And then there's other utilities and analysis tools that are available. So I mentioned Visit and PairView are sort of the two of the primary tools that we use. They're both open source, largely supported by DOE in terms of their development. PairView, Kitware, there's a company that is the primary maintainer of it, but National Labs also contributed quite a bit to it. And so these are both general purpose visualization applications. So it's not domain specific. There's lots of different representations, and I'll show some of them. and data formats that can be used with these tools. They're GUI based, so they're great for doing interactive data exploration. They have a client server model, right, which enables you to run, in particular, in parallel. So they're both meant to be distributed memory, large scale, right? So often your data doesn't fit on a single node, so you can run it a parallel server on Cooley, for example, and then connect to it from a lightweight client that you run on your local machine to do the exploration. But it's also scriptable, so you can use it in batch mode. So generally, the way we tend to use these tools is you use it interactively to build up your pipelines and create your visualization. Explore the data, figure out what it is that you want to show, and then take that and those pipelines and build them into scripts that you can then submit in batch to render animations, for example. They're both also extendable. They have Python interfaces, so it's easy to create additional readers if it doesn't support the particular format that your code uses. And they're both built largely on top of VTK, and they both have in situ capabilities, which again Silvio will talk more about in the second half of this presentation. So VTK is more of a programming environment, API, has lots of additional capabilities and some finer controls, but it also requires more expertise, right? So you're largely building custom applications if you're using that directly. So these tools support, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but lots of different data formats. There's probably others that I'm missing here. And it's also, I mentioned these things are extensible, so it's easy enough to, if your code is, if your data is not in one of these particular formats, with a little bit of work, you can write a custom reader as a plugin to load your data. So I'm briefly going to walk through sort of the process of running ParaView on Cooley and/or Theta. The process is similar but not exactly the same for Visit. So currently, the most recent version of ParaView that we have on Theta and Cooley is 5.5.2. 5.6 has been out for a little bit, and 5.7 is in the near future. So we'll get those out relatively soon. But essentially, you launch your client locally, and then you say that you want to connect to a server, right? And so the first time you do this, there's files. There's a configuration file that says how to connect to Theta or Cooley, for example. And so if you click on this fetch servers, there's a list of the different servers that are available for that you can download from their website, which has information that we've provided for them that makes the process easy. So you just fetch this server, and then when you're ready to connect, you say that you want to connect, and then it'll pop up this little GUI here that you fill out a couple of things. For example, the project that you're going to charge, how many nodes you want, how long, the version of ParaView that you're going to use. So this is the version, so your client version and your server version should match, right? So that should probably say 5.5.2. And then the other relevant thing right now is that you need to make sure that the path to a local xterm, and there's also if you're on Windows, there's a similar server config specifically for Windows that you can download when you do that fetch servers thing. And this is largely for authentication. So when you do this, it's going to try and establish a connection to Theta or Cooley, whichever one you're trying to run this on. And basically, it's going to prompt you for your one-time password. So you use your crypto key and password to log in there. and then it will submit a job for you that using the specifics that you asked for, the number of nodes and processes, et cetera. It will launch that, submit a job to the queue, start peer review for you, and then connect back to your local client. And at that point, when you say open file, you're then browsing the file system. Yeah. So on Theta, you can use the debug queue and request a smaller number of nodes. Yeah, so, yes, on Theta, you can run on a single node using the debug queue. So now I'll jump into what are some of the things that you can do with this tool. So there's lots of different types of data representations. One of them I touched on a second ago, which is volume rendering. So Visit and PairView both have capabilities for doing this. I mentioned VL3, which is our custom application for doing this. And essentially, you're taking a volume of data, and there's different methods for doing this, but essentially you're casting rays through a volume, and every time you intersect, you take multiple samples along a ray. Every time you intersect, you look up the value of that sample in a lookup table that says this is the color that this sample should be and how much how opaque or transparent it should be. And so you add up these samples along the ray to come up with the final color, and then that allows you to do, for example, on our little mouse friend here, you can say, oh, well, values, and so this is, I believe, X-ray, so it's essentially the density. So you can set ranges of values that say, oh, I know values in this range are bone, and values in some other range are muscle or some other tissue. And so you can use that to essentially select colors and transparency levels for sort of known ranges of data values. Similarly, in the CT scan, as well as in this one here, this is a mixture of hot and cold fluid. And so you can set, particular ranges, and this is an example of what that, the blue to white to red is I believe it's temperature. And then this little mark here is the transfer function, essentially saying that if values are below here, then they're going to be transparent, and as that line goes up, they become more opaque. Maybe it's vice versa. So glyphs are another sort of popular representation, and these are more for using 2D or 3D geometric objects to represent point data, right? So the location is dictated by the coordinate, either on a 3D mesh or, for example, if you're doing a 2D table or graph, the position is represented. Location is dictated by that coordinate. And then the way we think of visualization in most aspects for scientific data is basically you're taking attributes of the data and applying graphical attributes to those those data attributes. So, for example, color, size, and orientation are dictated by the data. So, for example, in this one on the left, these arrows are the direction of the arrows and the scale are dictated by some scalar vector field, right? So they're oriented in the direction of this flow. In this example, they're also colored by their velocity, for example. So this is looking down the end of essentially the same data problem, looking down at the end of a tube, and the particles in the middle are moving much faster than the ones around the perimeter because those are bumping into the walls, for example. So contours or isosurfaces. Isosurfaces for 3D data, isoline essentially for 2D data, right? Basically represents a constant value through the data. And Visit and PairView are both good at this. VTK, because Visit and PairView are largely built on VTK, is also good at this, but again, it requires a little bit more effort. And so you can also do things like, for example, in this top image, I forget off the top of my head what the variable is that we're looking at, but there's multiple surfaces and they're each colored. They're colored by their ISO value, right? And so there's one surface that's has a high value that's red. These blue ones are lower value, as opposed to, for example, in this image where there's actually a single ISO value here. So the surface is dictated by one variable, but then the color is dictated by a second variable. So you can do things like, show me if you have a particular value that's known to have some relevance to your science, say, show me this ISO value, ISO surface for this data, and then color it by some other variable that's in the same field. Cutting planes, very similar to, and it's basically what it sounds like. You put a plane or slice through your data and color it by the values that are in that part of the mesh that you intersect. Again, visit and peer review really good at this, as well as VTK. VMD, the molecular dynamics tool, has some similar capabilities for certain formats. Streamlines are a representation where this is essentially vector data, and it needs to be data that's on a mesh, right? So that it needs some connectivity, because what it's going to you place some seed points in the mesh, and then within a single time step, trace that forward. So you follow the vector field along the mesh within a single time step, and get essentially at a given time what the flow field would look like. Again, visit peer review VTK, all good at this. There's another representation called path lines, which is more time dependent. So in that case, rather than following the path of the data through a single time step, you go from one step to the next, and it can do things like follow the path that a particle takes over time. Again, I mentioned most of the things we've looked at so far are sort of domain agnostic. There's lots of different science domains that use those types of data representations. Molecular dynamics is one that's more sort of domain specific. It uses some of the similar types of representations. So, for example, you consider these spheres could be considered as glyphs, for example. But then it also has things like that are representations that are more domain specific. And so again, VMD is one of the popular tools for doing that. It supports lots of different file formats. You can do animations, make it scriptable, etc. Visit and peer review has limited support, but actually there's actually been some work in recent years where they're actually improving their support for molecular data. In fact, they also have there's been a new VTK, which is essentially in addition to being an API, is a file format. There's a VTK molecule data format. So these tools are expanding in that space as well. So I mentioned that, so a lot of this has been for data exploration and explanation of your data. And so where the visualization is essentially the final product, right? Where in this case, we're using it for debugging, for example. And so I like to show this example. This is actually the same team that from the blood flow stuff that I showed at the beginning. And in this example, this is a flow field over these two propellers. And the propellers rotate in opposite directions, and they're actually marine propellers. And so essentially the fluid or water is moving from right to left. And so they had this problem with this code and their results, and they didn't understand why. So I visualized for them, and so keep your eye on this propeller on the right. So as the simulation progressed and these two propellers keep rotating and the fluid keeps moving over them, the first one goes away. right? So they had some bug in their code where they failed to reinitialize something, and so one of the propellers went away. And so, as you can imagine, without that first propeller, the results are much different than what they would have expected, right? But they didn't understand why until we did this visualization. So it helped them to discover this bug in their code, right? So this is what they would have expected to see, and you can kind of see underneath here in white is where those propellers are. And then we're seeing these vortices that are forming as the two propellers are rotating. And so these are the structures they expected to see, but were not, right, because of that lost propeller. We've also used it in cases for doing diagnostics, for example. And so this was a case I mentioned that we have we do the cosmology stuff that we did using volume rendering with our code. And we were trying to improve the performance of the code. And so we were working on threading it. And we were trying to understand the best way to lay out the threads across the data. So in this image here, it's this volume rendering that I explained before, where basically you cast rays and you look. And so for each essentially data point in the data, you color it by the data values that you find there. But instead what we did was for each value, rather than coloring it by the value that we found there, we colored it by the ID of the thread that was processing the data, right? So in that way, we can get an idea of how the threads are distributed across the volume. Now, I don't remember which one of these four was the best choice, but you can see that clearly, depending on how we did the threading layout, we got very different results in how that was distributed. And one of these was the winner, I just don't remember which. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Silvio.
So, let's talk a bit about in situ viz and analysis. So, for most of the techniques that Joe has been describing, what we do is essentially get data after the simulation is finished, right? After the simulation completed. So that may take some time, right? We could be visualizing or analyzing the data a month or more later after the simulation is done, right? But there are some cases where we need the visualization or analysis to happen while the simulation is running and while the data is in memory, right? So that is what we're trying to cover here. We will be covering two different frameworks that are part of DOE, are supported by and funded by DOE, and that we're part of. We're part of these two teams. One is the Sensei in situ project, and the other is the Ascent project, or part of Alpine ECP. ECP is the Exascale Computing Project that with the mission of delivering applications for exascale machines. So let's cover first some aspects of Sensei. And this is actually a multi-institution project with national labs like Berkeley, Argonne, and Oak Ridge, and also companies, right? Companies creating this project. So Intelligent Light is actually using Visit as part of their project, as part of their products. And Kidware, as Joe described, is the main companies supporting or developing ParaView. So we use all of those platforms, but I would like to describe why we want to use in situ, right? So as I said, in situ is when we do the visualization and analysis, and the data is in memory. So the visualization code runs on the same node, and they share the resources with the simulation, right? The reason, or one of the reasons for that is because the storage is expensive, right? And at the same time, there's a gap that is actually increasing between the flops on the supercomputers and the bandwidth for storage. So, assuming that you do the traditional workflow, saving snapshots of your data for post hoc visualization, you may need to do it every n time steps, say every 100 time steps, right? Because of your limitations of bandwidth and storage. But there may be something happening between those 100 time steps that you may be missing, right? Because of that limitation. So you want to have the entire data set available for analysis and visualization. And that's what's going to happen, that this thing, it's actually going to happen in exascale machines. So the community, our community proposes this solution that is called visualization, in situ visualization and analysis. And it's essentially that. Combining the simulation with the analysis or visualization code and sharing data while the data is in memory. The Sensei project approach is essentially defining an API for sharing that data and actually creating or defining also a specific data model for that. And this is what the architecture of a Sensei or of an application or a simulation instrumented with Sensei looks like. So the simulation appears here on the left. There's some code here that I'm going to show in detail in a moment. And this is actually the glue transferring the data from simulation to multiple backend analysis. So there's a lot of possibilities here, right? Catalyst, for example, is the in situ version of ParaView. So that's a library where you can access most of the filters and rendering capabilities of ParaView in situ. Similarly, for Visit, there is LiveSim. They have a component that you can build into your application called LiveSim. Adios is also a well-known code for I/O and data movement. So all of this is already supported in our specific version of Sensei. Notice also Ascent here because I'm going to cover this in future slides. So there's some interoperability between these two different in situ frameworks. So one of the design guidelines for Sensei was to write the algorithm once and run it everywhere. So if you have a code that is already instrumented, you could actually enable all of this analysis. And if you have already an analysis, an analysis algorithm already written, it should apply to any other code that you instrument with Sensei and provides the same kind of data, right? So another interesting feature, and this is about the internals, how this is implemented. So there's three main things in a code instrumented with Sensei. There is a data adapter that makes the data available and puts it in something called the VTK format. There is a bridge code that takes care of bridging the simulation with the analysis side, and there's the configurable analysis adapter. And it's interesting that the configurable analysis adapter can receive an XML file that is actually really simple to write. And with that, you can enable multiple backends. So this is what, and in a very simplified way, this is what an instrumented simulation looks like, right? So pay attention to the blue light here. So this is what we're adding to a simulation to instrument it, right? So there's the initialization of the simulation itself, and then you want to call the initialize in the bridge, right? Passing mostly your MPI communicators to the other side. And then every time you compute a time step, a time step is computed, you do an update or execute passing the data to the other side and doing your analysis. And then when the simulation is done, before calling the finalizing the sim, you call the finalize in Sensei. And that's pretty much it. This is all you need to do to instrument an application. And keep this diagram in mind because I'm going to show a similar thing for Ascent, right? And this is what the XML that you pass to the configurable analysis adapter looks like, right? So it's really easy to read here. In this case, you are requesting a histogram, for example. You want to get atoms as your input mesh. From atoms, you're going to use the atom type as the field that you're going to do a computation with. And you're defining 10 bins for your histogram, right? And this enable, it's a flag that you can set to 0 or 1. 1 in this case is enabling a histogram by atom ID. And there's multiple of this analysis that you could be enabling here. So your XML file could be arbitrarily long. See, for example, here, this is actually enabling a way of saving files in BTK format. So we want to avoid saving files and hitting the disk. But at some point, you may want to actually use it, especially during debugging, to test your output, right? So there's this capability too. So I'm going to show a quick example of what a Catalyst pipeline will look like, or how you will create that. Essentially, 3 steps. Load some data that represents what you're going to do in situ, right? This is all offline. This is all running on your own desktop, how you create this, that you're going to feed to the simulation instrument. Then you define the visualization pipeline and then export a Python script. So the peer review interface looks like this, right? So you're loading the data here, atoms in this case. You're creating a glyph, like Joe explained earlier, in this case, sphere glyphs. They're colored by atom type, so they're all same in blue here. And when you're happy with what you're seeing in there, this kind of picture, go to the Catalyst menu and generate script. So that will export, it will give you some menus to export a Python script. And this is actually previous version of Purview. It's in the most recent one. It's a little bit different, but conceptually the same. So the idea is that you're happy with this visualization, export your Python script. And then you pass that Python script to Sensei. So I named it Gaussian points by ID, right? This is the XML file that I'm passing to Sensei. And I'm telling it, I want Catalyst as my backend, right? And I'm going to use a Python script. I want it enabled. And in every step of the simulation, Catalyst will be dumping pictures like this. We'll be creating pictures like this from my data. Okay, in this case, this is the atoms colored by ID, by atom ID. So that's why there's this changing spectrum of colors. Okay, this is just a very simple example, but you can make it as complex as needed. And in this case, generating 1 PNG picture per time step. So you could do other things, like perhaps extracts of the data, simplifying the data for future analysis, or many other things. This is another more experimental project that we had. And in this case, we're using a different concept here. So I've been talking about in Situ, right, where everything is in the same compute nodes. But there's another possibility that we call in transit, where you move some data to a different partition of the machine, or perhaps to another machine, perhaps to a geographically distant machine to do the analysis. But you do it while the simulation is running. And in this case, this is what we're doing here. This is LAMP's molecular dynamics code, instrumented with Sensei, but it's moving its data to a different MPI rank, and in this case, running on the same machine, but it's they're separated through, there's network communication to pass the data. And we're visualizing the data interactively. So if click here, it should play. And I'm going to pause here to describe what you're going to see. There's 3 terminals there. So this is actually the instrumented simulation, right? This is LAMPs generating data and sharing it. The terminal in the middle is actually the one that receives the data and is actually doing the rendering or interactive rendering. visualization. And the third one is actually a client, a visualization client that will launch the visualizer, a window with graphics. So this is what you're going to see. If I press the right. So there it is. LAMP is running and generating data. Now they're launching the client renderer here, and this is the visualization window. So the user is actually able to visualize how the data is generated in the simulation while the simulation is running. And you can interact, and you can define multiple viewpoints. And in fact, we're working on the next version of Sensei is going to have some bidirectional interactivity. So we will be able to send the data back to the simulation from the client. So with this, we'll move to the next framework that is called Ascent, also in DOE, and this is part of the exascale computing program. And these slides are actually what the team presented at the all hands meeting recently in January, at the ACP all hands meeting. So here's a quick description of Ascent. And remember that I told you to pay attention to the instrumented simulation in Sensei? Well, look at this. This is essentially the same concept here, right? This is what a simplified view of Ascent will look like, right? So you define it, open an instance here, publish the data, execute every time step, right? And then close. Very similar to the workflow presented in the Sensei case. In this case, in the case of Ascent, they are focusing on these three main aspects, right? Making pictures, transforming data, or capturing data, capturing extracts of the data. In this case, the data model is different. It's not VTK like in the previous, like in the Sensei case. In this case, they define the data model or how the data is going to be shared through a thermal called conduit from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. It is a way of describing your data. You create kind of dictionaries or metadata to describe the arrays that are coming. And so the analysis side can understand what you're feeding to it. And in terms of analysis and visualization, they're primarily using a library called VTK-M, which is an extension of the original VTK. This is mostly for parallelism in node, right? So, or extreme parallelism in node. It's using data parallel primitives to implement all its algorithms. So in node they use VTK-M, and for communication they use MPI. And these are common things, common visualization tasks that are already enabled in Ascent, and some of them are already described by Joe in the first part of the talk, right? So, for example, you could create clips and visualize them, clips of the data, some extracts of the data, ISO volumes, or thresholding the data, creating slices that are a good effective way which is kind of lightweight for visualizing a 3D data set. Contours or isosurfaces, and multiple different types of rendering, including volume rendering. So this is their design guidelines, right? So they want to be flexible, easy to use, and easy to connect with other things. So these things are either visualization algorithms or analysis algorithms. There's many of these algorithms in the pipeline, like topology related and things like that. In this case, they support for language bindings. They support C and C++, Python, and Fortran. And for output types, they support the well-known libraries like HDF, Adios, and Cinema. Cinema we haven't described here, but Cinema is a project from Sandia And the idea here is to create image databases that you can explore offline. So as part of your in situ workflow, you will be creating images per time step, a collection of images that you can see from multiple places, right? And that is your result that you can explore offline interactively, right? So you could be visualizing those multiple time steps from different angles and activating or deactivating different variables. I think I'm almost close to my time. These are examples, and if you use the code, you will find that there's 3 mini apps already instrumented, so you can play with them and see how it works. And I'm going to show some additional resources that you will find in the PDF that it's available. For Sensei, this is the main page. They have a GitLab repo where the code lives. But this is the most interesting part. We usually give a tutorial at Supercomputing. You can download that material from here, including the slides and the virtual machine that you can run on your resources. So all the development environment is there. And there are some examples that you can run. So I'll highly encourage you to try that if you're interested in this. For Ascent, similar, right? The website, and also there you will find a link to their tutorial where you can download the slides and you can download their code to try a simple application instrumented with it and see what you can do with it. And if you're interested in doing hands-on later today or later at a different date, here are some additional resources, right? So we'll ask you to download ParaView 552 because that's the one that we already have in production and on Beta and Cooley. And there's a tutorial here that Joe wrote, available here at ALCF for the red blood cells. So it guides you step by step on how to visualize that kind of data. There's a guide of how to use ParaView and Cooley, and that mostly applies to data as well. And there's some data. The data for the red blood cell tutorial is here, and you can access it because it's part of the project space that we have for this workshop. So the data lives here, okay? So you can follow on the tutorial with all this. With that, we'll conclude our presentations, and we'll be happy to take any questions you may have. If you don't have questions now or have questions later, we'll be around, and you can always reach out by email, okay? Any questions? It will be. We can talk offline, but we will need first to understand the data, right? This is kind of a 3D grid data that you're creating, like a 3D regular grid. Yeah, we can show you how to fit that into this kind of tools. Yes. Any other questions? Okay, we'll be around. Feel free to stop by and ask. All right. Thank you.